Okay, welcome back. So, next story we're going to talk about is actually a very ongoing story. Now, this is the ACCC, who, at the start of COVID, and I think it was for a period of about 2 years, were asked by the Morrison government to produce kind of quarterly reports on the aviation industry. And this was because the Morrison government, quite correctly, saw that you were going to have a shutdown of the industry and then you were going to have it start up again. You were going to have all sorts of networks and services kind of switch hands, and you were going to have a once-in-a-generational change. And the government, the federal government of the time, said that we need the ACCC to effectively have special powers to keep a tab on this and make sure nobody is stepping out of line. And these quarterly reports actually become incredibly useful tool, particularly for us journalists, because they were able to get hold of data and be able to get hold of information that previously or would otherwise be very difficult for us to get. And that is because as the ACCC, they can approach an airline or approach a company and they can request kind of competitive information. So this gave us a unparalleled look into how the recovery was working. Now, these reports continued all the way through into, I think it was 6 months ago, halfway through last year.
About June last year.
Yeah, but we had our last one, and then their remit ended. And anyway, what the new Labour federal government did was to come in and basically restart these again, because we've still had so much problems with delays and with cancellations, and the fact the industry isn't totally righted itself from COVID. We've had the first report drop a couple of weeks ago. Jake, what are they saying now?
So what they've said that since the peak in airfares in late 2022, domestic airfares have fallen over the last 12 months when adjusted for inflation. But even so, consumers would still be paying significantly more to fly in nominal terms than they did prior to the pandemic. So airfares have come down, but consumers are still kind of feeling the squeeze. And the ACCC has also noted that but more competition is still needed. So, there are now... They've pointed out that the aviation sector in Australia looks quite different domestically from where it was before the pandemic, because before the pandemic, Virgin was sort of positioned, alongside Qantas as a more premium carrier, whereas it had its Tiger Air arm for budget flights. Rex had not moved into domestic jet operations. Bonza was a twinkle in Tim Jordan's eye. Since the pandemic, Tiger's gone, as we've mentioned before. Virgin went into administration, came out as this hybrid mid-range thing. So Qantas and Jetstar have less competition on both the premium and the bottom end of the markets. You've got Rex now flying between capital cities on 737-800s, some of which used to be from Virgin. And of course, there's Bonza, Australia's first high-capacity airline in 15 years, that is doing this new thing of connecting all these holiday and regional destinations point to point without going through major capital cities.
So it's interesting there. They were able to find out that fares had kind of gone down, but perhaps not as much as they would have hoped earlier. Now, that is understandable in that you've got this cost of living crisis. We've had wildly fluctuating prices for jet fuel. One of the last in the previous series of ACCC quarterly reports, back kind of a year or so ago, effectively warned airlines that they needed to get capacity back in the market and bring those prices down. To be fair, airlines did bring the capacity back, but obviously it's been a very difficult last 12 months. What other kind of insight were they able to give us?
Well, it's interesting. They've mentioned that there is now a route. Melbourne to Gold Coast, for the first time, now has 4 different airline groups operating that route. So you've got Qantas Group, Virgin, Rex, and Bonza are all now flying Melbourne Tullamarine to Gold Coast. So this is like a kind of a landmark in competition in the aviation industry. That said, while about half of all domestic passengers in Australia last year flew on routes that were served by 3 or more competing airlines, Rex and Bonza do typically fly fewer services compared to the Qantas Group and Virgin. Qantas Group especially, with Qantas and Jetstar combined.
Now, in addition to that, we also had a separate report by an ACCC chairman that was commissioned by the ACTU, if I remember that correctly.
Yes.
Kind of looking at, I mean, it looked at a number of different industries and kind of competition and how it affects prices of things, basically. But one of the largest areas it looked at was aviation. What were some of the kind of conclusions of that? Because that came out about a week or so before the kind of the proper ACCC report.
Yeah, so this was a report by former ACCC chairman Alan Fels for the ACTU. It basically said the duopoly, this is a quote, the duopoly in the aviation sector in Australia is dominated by Qantas and there is price gouging by Qantas. And called for what Fels said was unnecessary restrictions on competition in domestic and international aviation to be removed. Now, Qantas has, of course, come out and denied that it is price gouging. It said in a statement, both Qantas and Jetstar appreciate the importance of affordable air travel. It pointed to this data showing this decline in average airfares from that peak in late December, in December 2022. Qantas said sale fares are frequently available, with Qantas offering an average of 17 network-wide sales per year and Jetstar offering 10 million fares for less than $100 last year. Now, Qantas has also said that Australia is one of the most liberalised aviation markets in the world. Said, unlike a lot of other jurisdictions, there are no restrictions on foreign carriers setting up domestic operations here. While the domestic market is concentrated, it is still highly competitive. There are now 4 large jet operators, with Regional Express expanding onto mainline routes and the entry of Bonza. Australia has open skies agreements with key markets, including the US, UK, New Zealand and China, and consumers can choose from over 50 airlines that offer international services from Australia.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, yes, so they're saying it's one of the most liberalised countries for air travel. They are talking about their number of open skies agreements, which effectively allow the market to decide when international flights happen. But it is also the case that to have a local aviation industry in which one player has 65 to 70%, depending on how you divvy it up, is fairly extraordinary.
It is.
And it's also fairly extraordinary for a very wealthy country with a decent-sized population.
And keep in mind as well that, for the longest time during the 20th century, Australia, by law, had 2 domestic airline groups. It was TAA/Australian, which later merged, with Qantas, and it was Ansett, and that was it. So now the laws mandating the duopoly are gone, but one could possibly argue that the effects of that long time Qantas Ansett duopoly have kind of remained, because Qantas is still the biggest airline group in Australia, and there's still only one major competitor to it, which is Virgin. Admittedly, Virgin, not Ansett, very famously, but it's kind of Qantas has for a very long time been the beneficiary of a lot of a very big beneficiary of the way things are in the Australian aviation sector. And it's had all that time. TAA and Australian Airlines had all that time to sort of build itself up. When Ansett collapsed, there was really no other major competitor until Virgin Blue really came along and took up a whole bunch of that market. So, Qantas and Jetstar have had it pretty good for a pretty long time.
Yeah, and I will throw this over to you in a little bit to talk about this. But basically, Jake interviewed a very fascinating interview with Tim Jordan, the CEO of Bonza, and he said a number of things about competition. But one of the things that we ran as a kind of a separate story that was quite fascinating is that he obviously found outside investment or foreign investment from 777 partners to come in and launch Bonza. But he basically said, I was trying to make this work for like nearly a decade or so, and he had multiple discussions with local investors to see if they would get on board with his idea. And what he basically said was almost that what he was told was the duopoly of Qantas and Virgin was so impregnable that no investor wanted to come near it. And so in that sense, this kind of duopoly and the power of Qantas is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in that you just forever lock out any kind of rivals and you make it more and more and more and more and difficult. He also said some other things as well about the problem with airport monopolies. And so just to give you all a little bit of background, Australia, not entirely uniquely, but
we have discussed this on the podcast before.
Exactly. The idea that in Australia, all the states effectively have one major big airport, which means they are a monopoly. If you want to fly in there, all the airlines have to deal with one particular airport. Tim spoke a little bit about that. What did he say?
Yeah, so Tim Jordan had some particularly high praise for Melbourne because Bonza flies both to Avalon and Tullamarine. And he said they have their own distinct catchments. So Australia has Melbourne doing that. He said that Sydney is going to have Western Sydney International doing that when it opens in 2026. So, the Western Sydney Airport and Sydney Airport will serve those different catchment areas. And, he said that, Bonza would dearly love to serve one of them immediately, the other one in 2026. But he said, why stop there? This is a quote from him. Why couldn't there be multiple airports in Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth? Airport monopolies are not necessarily good for the aviation industry. Strangely enough, if there's more than one airport in a location, it's generally good for airlines and very good for customers as well. We'll all have our preference for our local airport. So he said, in terms of Sydney, we would like to think of serving both Sydney airports in the way we already today service both Melbourne airports because they have their own independent catchments. And there was some discussion as well in the Facebook comments, surprisingly civil, on this story, talking about, people saying, Brisbane kind of has like Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast and Toowoomba as well as kind of like secondary airports. Perth, Busselton, Margaret River could be a secondary airport for Perth. So it's there's airports around the country, like smaller regional places, not far from the major capital cities that could serve as secondary airports. But I think Margaret River is something like 2 hours from the Perth CBD. And even in Sydney, we do have Newcastle, a couple of hours away.
Australia's in a very, very unique position for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's a country that is extraordinarily wealthy, actually, sort of relative to its population. But it's also a country that is expanding very rapidly. So its population has grown enormously, I say over the last 10 years, over the last 20, 30 years. And when you think about not just building an airport, it's not a simple thing. It's almost 10, 15 years in the making. So you've got the fact this country is kind of constantly changing, that the population is dispersed. That's one of the reasons why we have monopoly airports. This is a difficult thing to plan for. If you're in a more built up country, or even if you're in Europe, it's much more easy to justify these things. So in a sense, Australian aviation, not us, the lowercase a, is in this kind of no man's land where it needs to think about what it's going to do in 20, 30 years.
Which is what this white paper is for.
Yeah, exactly, which is what the government's white paper, looking at what the future of the industry will be like and giving a kind of what's meant to be a rough pathway forward for the industry. We are starting to see the sort of the green shoots of forward thinking with Western Sydney Airport, which will be for the first time kind of re-break those monopolies. But this is definitely something that we need to think about to increase competition moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah. And to your point, Adam, Tim Jordan has pointed out, on a few occasions, it's been, 20 years since Virgin Blue started up. It's been like 30 years since Compass. Australia has not seen new major players in the airline market for some time. And, back in the early 90s when, I think it was the early 90s when Compass was getting going, there was not a lot of people. There was not nearly as many people in Australia as there are now. And even 20 years ago, when Virgin Blue was starting up, there were not as many people in Australia as there are now. And I think Virgin Blue may also have benefited a bit from the demise of Ansett. So that might have helped them get going a bit. But, Bonza is kind of has entered the market in a time where there is, a lot more people that could justify its existence in a way that Compass could not back in the 90s.
Wow. And this is going to be a local radio DJ link. We talk about the future and we talk about your interview with Tim Jordan.